Good afternoon, class. I'm going to pick up where we left off in class today. We're talking about really the sort of, I guess, the final. We're at the point in world history here by the late 1700s, the 18th century, where we're sort of witnessing the decline of a fairly long-standing and powerful economic system known as the mercantile system or mercantilism. And we're going to see it give way, as I mentioned in class, it's going to ultimately give way to a capitalist system, which is, in many ways, capitalism is sort of one of the intellectual frameworks of the modern world. And so, as we enter into chapter 14, a little later this week, we're going to be noticing that among the powerful European Enlightenment thinkers, there will be a particular individual, Adam Smith, who in many ways is going to refute or challenge the premises and the practices of the mercantilist system, which is the focal point that we're tending to with today's lesson. So I'm going to click through here. Obviously, those of you who are in class today are going to have a decent sense of what we're talking about with these terms. We talked a little bit about the challenges that mercantilism posed to particularly the colonial possessions in the periphery of Europe's mother countries. And again, those are terms that hopefully are starting to settle in and make sense to most of you. And I left off today sort of setting up this metaphor, this I guess, metaphorical story of thinking of the English colonists in North America as the equivalent of teenagers who had moved across town, and for the first couple of years of fighting very hard and fighting the challenges of being alone and independent and trying to find one's way through the rough and tumble world of survival and paying bills and feeding oneself and working. This adolescent, this teenager, which we'll now refer to as the English colonists, they had fared surprisingly well for themselves. But after a century or so of what is this salutary neglect, meaning this willingness of the crown to more or less pretend that its English colonists didn't exist, in the early 1700s, and especially by the mid-1700s, the crown, the English crown, is going to try to, well, I shouldn't say the crown, it's not even just the crown, it's also Parliament. The English are going to try to tighten their hold on their colonies. And the fact that they had not done so before during this period of salutary neglect is going to make it all the more difficult for them to try to reestablish control and power over their wayward colonies by the mid-18th century. So, a little spoiler alert, mercantilism will start to give way to capitalism by the late 18th century, and capitalism will be far more accurate in describing the economy that the soon-to-be-born United States adopts as its preferred framework for trade and commercial relations. But we're not quite there yet. Okay, so the colonies in British North America are going to emerge as an independent part of the world, right? Obviously in 1776, when Thomas Jefferson drafts and the Continental Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence, that was in 1776 before the Revolutionary War in America. And so, of course, there's nothing about the Declaration of Independence that necessarily meant a whole lot at the time it was passed, because all the heavy lifting, the difficult work, if you will, was going to be the colonists fighting against Great Britain and essentially forcefully establishing their independence. But the Declaration of Independence all the same was a very high-minded, very ambitious, and aspiring document that will give powerful words and powerful ideas to these colonists as they now set about the hard work of separating themselves from Great Britain. But Great Britain was as you know, hopefully you can appreciate this, one way in which Great Britain was different than other European powers of this time was that it at least had a limited government, meaning the power of the king was checked by a somewhat democratic body known as Parliament. And I say democratic in the sense that, members of Parliament represented the people of Great Britain, though not perfectly, represented them better than the king. There was a check on the king's power, and this was an important thing to understand. The Parliament had essentially even made itself a little more powerful than King George by the time of the American Revolution. And in some ways this created some problems because, if you recall a little bit of your colonial history, the charters that the English colonists in North America had agreed to were with the king, not with Parliament. And nonetheless, Parliament, in the process of sort of wresting powers from the kings of England, and we know that a big part of this happened in 1689 with the Glorious Revolution, in which William and Mary were invited to take over the crown of England. However, that invitation took place with the full knowledge that they would be subject to sharing their power with Parliament. And so this was a real victory for the forces of Parliament because they effectively had a check. Now, if we come back to the colonies, the English colonies in North America, it's worth noting that the colonies in North America had their own nobility. I mean, in some ways, the genteel class, or the nobility, or the aristocrats, however you want to say it, they sort of had a natural tension with the nobility of Great Britain. You see, American nobility, the colonists, the colonial nobility, thought themselves to be something close to equal with their counterparts in Great Britain. But their counterparts in Great Britain, the wealthy aristocrats, never for a moment imagined that folks like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, never imagined that they were even in the same league with the British nobility. British were rather arrogant on that front, but they also probably, they really were far more powerful, far more wealthy than their colonial counterparts. But nonetheless, it created sort of a frustration. And as the colonies settled, and so this experience and act of settling the American continent was really a source of pride for a lot of British colonials in the Americas. And in the mid-1700s, an important global conflict broke out known as the 7 Years' War. And this war had many theaters. Some of the theaters were in Europe, some were in even the Philippines, some were in India, and most importantly for the soon-to-be United States, one of them was in North America. And as a result of the 7 Years' War, a few things happened. One, Great Britain and her colonists, her, the people that she ruled in North America, are going to team up and win a very important victory over France and a coalition or confederacy of natives. And on the face of it, it would seem that this was a wonderful victory for Great Britain and her colonial subjects. And that was true to a point. It's always great to win. But the 7 Year War, or the French and Indian War, as it's also known, was also a time of difficulty for the British and the British colonists, because folks like George Washington, who fought alongside the Brits in this conflict, quickly realized there was an incredible amount of arrogance and insult that the British military and her ranking officers and generals, they never thought of the colonial troops, colonial soldiers, as being anywhere close to their caliber of military. And that was a stinging rebuke, and that's going to not be forgotten. Part of the frustration that the colonists will have with Great Britain and her government and her military and her officers on the eve of the Revolutionary War, which will happen 15, 20 years later, is they remember how disrespected they felt by the British when they were fighting in the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, together. And so that's not going to be lost, and folks like George Washington will carry that sting with them for some time. Two other things noteworthy here is that the French and Indian War, even though the English colonists in North America and Great Britain, even though they teamed up to win, most of the bill or the expenses tied to this war were absorbed by Great Britain. And as such, she's going to come out of the French and Indian Wars looking for ways to make up monies lost. And naturally, taxes on the colonies, or taxes in the colonies, is going to be one of her leading strategies, leading ideas for making up these this lost revenue. And if you think about it, there's a certain natural sense to that, right? I mean, the French and Indian War was an expensive war, and it was a war fought essentially to keep the English colonies free of French rule. And as such, it would just make sense that the colonists themselves would help foot the bill for that. However, and the however is the colonists resented very much these taxes. They didn't have the freedom that they'd hoped for. In fact, the British Crown put in place what it called the line of demarcation, which meant that no English colonists in North America could move west of the Appalachian Mountains. This despite the fact that large portions of the American continent had been won by Britain. And so it created these sort of no-go zones. It created a sense of lingering animosity for the insults that the colonial military experienced at the hands of the British military. Perhaps most importantly, it created taxes that the colonists were unwilling to support. And particularly, they were unwilling to support these taxes if if the British Crown and Parliament weren't willing to allow the colonists themselves to be represented in the bodies of government, the chambers of government that were making these new taxation decisions. And so that, in and of itself, will become a very critical part of the history of this time, and much of this probably sounds familiar to you. And so with that, we'll stop. Thank you.